Good morning and welcome to episode 29 of Trapped in History. I am your host, Robbie Malcomson. This morning's episode is going to be entitled The Beginning of Absolutism and Constitutionalism. Now, if you went back to my previous episode on episode 28, I always start Unit 3 off with a Socratic seminar over power, control, authority, autonomy, sovereignty, topics like this, and I will show 3 visuals that students can use along with a lengthier secondary source that kind of introduces them to some of these topics like absolutism for the first time and constitutionalism. You have a visual from Louis XIV in the Royal Science Academy. You have a visual of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, the cover of that book with Charles I on it. And you have the famous portrait of Louis XIV. So you have 3 versions of art there that students can use as primary sources to be able to help them visualize and symbolize what an absolute monarch means. Now, as usual, let's start off with a quote of the episode. So we're going to be focusing on a quote from Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan, which was published in 1651. Now, Thomas Hobbes's point of view was an English political philosopher, and within this book he says famously, "If men are not kept in awe, they will hunt each other down like wolves." So when you hear the men are kept in awe, think in terms of men are kept in check, kept in balance. And if they're not controlled to an extent or kept in balance, then they will act animalistic. So a very dehumanizing element or factor there. Now it's important when you're bringing up Thomas Hobbes and you're using the Leviathan. Many teachers will use the Leviathan when they teach Unit 3. Especially in context of the English Civil War, is to really hit forward the concept of fear, power, and authority in Hobbes's view of government to set up a later comparison with John Locke's during the Glorious Revolution. Now, this is another great way to spiral back for contextualization and for continuity purposes to Machiavelli and the Prince. So me and my students at our school, we have a 2-week break between every 9 weeks. So when we come back, we have to do a little bit of a review just to kind of refresh them again about what we covered in Unit 1 and Unit 2. But this is a great opportunity to go back and say, let's look at Machiavelli again. Let's look at the Prince. Let's look at how he described human nature, why he argued for monarchies, and how he gave monarchs the advice on how to not only obtain power, but how to maintain that power whenever they get that. Now, the historical contextualization of the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes is deeply rooted in the political turmoil and violence of the 17th century England, particularly during the English Civil War, which took place in 1642 to 1651. Now, this is another opportunity to spiral back to the end of Unit 2 with the massive 30 Years' War that took place from 1618 to 1648. So as you can tell, students here, is that this war, as that war is winding down in the German states, this war starts up in 1642 to show them again that it's not like all these events stop and then start in European history and they're separate from each other, but they're somewhat tied in together. These are all conflicts that are going on for different kind of reasons. So understanding the circumstances in which Thomas Hobbes wrote this book provides essential insights into his arguments for a strong, centralized authority as the best means to maintain peace and avoid chaos in your society. And I always show students, maybe I'll start off class with a movie trailer of The Purge, one of the first Purge movies, and kind of say an extreme example, this is what he feels like society would be in anarchy. This is why there needs to be order maintained and control maintained, and that an absolute monarch should be able to do that. Now, I had made a mistake in a previous episode by inciting or insinuating that he also brought up divine right of kings, but I was wrong on that. He actually takes more of a secular model, just like Machiavelli did. So this is another continuity between him and Machiavelli, although they're geographically different and in 2 different time periods. Now, the document or source of the episode that many of you may consider using a part of in your class is towards the end of the unit, and that would be the English Bill of Rights, with the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and in 1689. Now, I'm going to read a small excerpt from the English Bill of Rights. And this excerpt reads, "Pretended power of suspending laws or the execution of laws by regal authority without consent of the Parliament is illegal." Now, that is a transcendental thing to say there, that a body of government like Parliament, now, like if you're comparing it to America, think of like Congress, and imagine Congress telling an absolute monarch that from now on, you doing anything like suspending laws or executing a certain kind of laws with your authority as a monarch is now illegal. So now that implies for the first time that these monarchs can be prosecuted like in a legal format. So this is that evidence, again, that's a transcendental idea, because this is one of those first examples of a monarch having to share power by the end of the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary. Now, when you think of the English Bill of Rights, consider who the intended audience is for something like that. And it's, you guessed it, it's the king. It's the monarchy in general. And this is something for them to be able to recognize and sign. And for the rest of history in England and Great Britain, this is going to have to be followed. And the Glorious Revolution really represents the death of absolute monarchy in British history. And I would even say the beginning of the decline of the power politically over the monarchy for the rest of the time. Now, for a little bit of a background of the document, this document, the Bill of Rights in England, it moved toward a constitutionalist government in England where royal authority was limited by parliamentary consent. This document symbolizes the shift away from absolutist rule towards a constitutional monarchy, paving the way for the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary. And we'll see a little bit more writing on that with John Locke as we go forward too. So let's move on forward to the main segment of the podcast today. And that's really going down through the beginning and summarizing, contextualizing what this unit's actually going to be. Now, as far as contextualizing absolutism by definition is a system of government where the monarchy holds supreme autocratic authority, unchecked by any other institution like legislators like Parliament or Congress or something like that. And other major examples of this that we'll hit on in the unit and that you as a teacher or you as a student may be addressing on is people like Louis XIV from France, Elizabeth I of England, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Philip I or Philip II from Spain, Peter the Great, and how they started to centralize control over their state, and many of them using philosophy like the divine right of kings to further use religion to justify their absolute rule. Now, in contrast to absolutism, constitutionalism is the limitation of governmental power by law, with an emphasis on the right of individuals, and the representation in government, and especially this during the Glorious Revolution in England, but also as another example, the Dutch Republic. These types of governments usually have representative bodies like a parliament and constitutional documents that protect individuals' rights, that limits the power of the king. And that way the monarch cannot just do whatever they want to do when they want to do it, at least without the consequence or conflicting with other branches of government that are meant to share power with the ruler. Now, one of your first major conflicts that you hit into in this unit is the English Civil War. And as we stated earlier, this conflict starts in 1642 and it will end in 1651. And then we'll have a pretty large gap there. And then in 1688 and 89, we'll see the Glorious Revolution. So in the English Civil War, we have two sides, generally speaking. We have the side of the Parliament, the representative body of government, meant to try to be grasping for more power and limiting power of the king. And we have an absolute monarch, Charles I of England. Now, the tensions between Charles I and Parliament led to a breakdown of royal authority over time. And remember, visually speaking, think of the cover of the Leviathan. If you get a chance to while you're listening to this episode, look that up on Google. Look up the cover or the front piece of the Leviathan. You can see Charles with a sword and staff like standing really colossally over top of a town. Now, Charles during this time period, he attempts to rule England without Parliament, and this is going to be exacerbated with the problems with his financial struggles and his imposition of taxes without the consent or permission of Parliament. So like Louis XIV, he also attempts to gain more power through multiple wars. And in order to be able to afford those wars, Charles is demanding money from Parliament to be able to do that. He recalls Parliament a couple of times to be able to have that happen. And of course, Parliament declines to be able to do that. And the king very controversially responds by eventually sending soldiers into Parliament and then having some members of Parliament arrested. This right here would be an act of treason in the eyes of many of these parliamentary members, which at the end of the war here will lead eventually to Charles's execution. Now, this is a pretty shocking moment. Imagine this if you're an American listener. Imagine, if the president, whoever he or she is, imagine if they sent American military in Congress and just started arresting congressmen and women. Now, imagine how big of a news story that would be. And remember, back then, there's no 24-hour news cycle at this time period, but it's still, that would be incredibly shocking to be able to kind of see that. And now, they have that, ability to reach out and try to demand from Charles to limit his power. So in 1628, before the war starts, Parliament does attempt to limit his power by trying to get Charles I to sign a document that I think you need to know, Frappi Euro, called the Petition of Right. Now, this document was an early constitutional check on Charles I's royal authority. This was Parliament's attempt to hold Charles I accountable. And as many of you may know, that's not very easy to do with an absolute monarch, somebody that has absolute power, started to centralize more control under taxation, forming bureaucracies, and having a standing military that is represented through them. So in this war, as the war starts in 1642, you're going to have two sides of the war. You have the Roundhead side. So the Roundheads do from their name from their haircuts, but also led by a man that's a leader of the Parliament named Oliver Cromwell, a name that you should become very familiar with. So you have the Roundheads as supporters of the Parliament versus the King's army, King Charles I. His army would be called the Cavaliers, or these would be supporters of the King. Now this division is a reflection of a lot of other deeper issues. There's deeper issues here politically over the governance and obviously through control. But remember, there's still also issues in England over religion and over individual rights, because we're finally getting into that era where we're kind of seeing we're in the middle of that scientific revolution era too, and an Enlightenment era where there's more talk and writing about what individual rights are deserved or owed to subjects or citizens. And obviously, that's not going to sit very well with an absolute monarch, especially if these said citizens are trying to protest or something like that. Remember, this is not a time period where we think that people have these constitutional rights and they have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We do see countries like France give some, I guess you'd say, some freedom of religion to an extent in the German states. But this is still a very new concept at this time. So as we progress through the war here, Oliver Cromwell, talking about him here, he's going to rise to prominence in this war in his leadership of this new group called the New Model Army, is what he calls himself. And ultimately, when the war ends, obviously Cromwell is going to take charge, and he's going to be basically a dictator, although he did not like to embrace the title of the dictator at first. But that's basically what he is, one of the first dictators that we have of the school year. Now, subsequently, King Charles I is put on trial, one of the first monarchs to be able to have that done to him, and he will be subsequently executed in 1649. And this is unprecedented to happen during a monarch. And one of my favorite speeches in world history, if you ever get a chance to look up the full speech, you should do that. It's in multiple books and whatnot, is read King Charles I's speech right before his execution. So we call it his execution speech in 1649. I want to read a little bit of a passage here just to show you what he was thinking right before he was going to die. And it gives a little bit more credence and depth to what he was trying to say here. So he says, "I die a Christian according to the profession of the Church of England, as I found it left me by my father. I have a good cause and a gracious God on my side. I go from a corruptible to a incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world. So right there, you can tell that Charles still leans upon his faith heavily, talking about possibly going to salvation or going to heaven after this is over and leaving a corruptible world. So even right there, he's insinuating that the society that he's leaving behind, that's going to be one ruled by Cromwell now for a while, is a corruptible one. Or it might even be a tie-in back to like the fact that human nature is corruptible to an extent. Now, under Cromwell's leadership, he will be called himself as the Lord Protector. And he establishes this Commonwealth idea that we get from Thomas Hobbes originally. Although Hobbes obviously does not agree with the end of this war here. Hobbes would have supported Charles I to be the leader. And after this war is over, Thomas Hobbes is going to be actually moving to France away from England. Now, Cromwell also states something very interesting after the war's over and after Charles is executed. He says at one point, I was by birth a gentleman, leading neither in considerable height nor yet in obscurity. I have been called to several employments in the nation, being constrained thereto by my conscience to serve the Lord and my country. So right there again, you have two leaders that obviously still lean on religion to kind of tie together with their rule. And again, he doesn't want to embrace this idea, this style of like a dictator, but he will be quite restrictive of some freedoms that he goes forward. And but again, his rule will not last super long. Now, in context of the English Civil War, we cannot overlook Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan and his views on government. Now, Hobbes argues for a strong centralized authority to avoid chaos and to avoid civil war. And obviously, and he writes that in 1651. And he himself, he himself witnessed the English Civil War. And he sees like the downside of that now. Now, according to Hobbes, the state of nature, the state of human nature is violent, and it's a condition that there needs to be something called a social contract where individuals give up their freedoms in exchange for security under a sovereign leader or sovereign ruler. It is important to note that Hobbes justified absolute monarchy not through divine right, but mainly through practical secular reasoning focused on human nature, similar to Machiavelli in The Prince. And during this time, when we're getting into the more Enlightenment time period and the scientific revolution time period, this is maybe a smart way for Hobbes to take with his intended audience, is to try to find a more secular reason for why a absolute monarchy should rule. Now, in contrast to Hobbes, we can fast forward to 1689 and a set of writings called the Two Treatises of Government, as written by John Locke. Now, remember, a lot of our ideas that we use in the United States for the foundation of our government, we read some characteristics from Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu and a lot of people like that. So Locke, in contrast to Hobbes, he encourages a new philosophy called natural rights. And these three natural rights are life, liberty, and property. And some of you listeners may find that very similar to what Thomas Jefferson had said in the Declaration of Independence about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you can see now where he got that from, considering that that's going to be 1776, and this is written in 1689. Now, according to Locke, the government's role is to protect these rights for the citizens, these natural rights. And if it fails, citizens have a right to revolt. And one of those common differences between Hobbes and Locke is that, under Hobbes' philosophy, there is no such thing as an unjust law. Like it is to the subjects or the citizens to have to give up some of their freedoms and rights for the sovereign, for the king. But it's the king's responsibility to protect those people. And that social contract has to maintain for there to not be chaos, to not be a civil war. And Locke is saying, and very similar to as we'll see with people like Rousseau and Voltaire in French history later, is that the citizens have a right to revolt if they need to when something like this happens. And that's one of those big differences. And again, we can kind of get into like our Bill of Rights and our Constitution in the United States, this right for freedom of speech, this right to assembly and protest. We get a lot of these ideas from men like John Locke. So remember, Hobbes believed that absolute authority, avoided chaos, whereas Locke argued for a government limited by law with power derived from the consent of the governed, the permission of those that are governed. This leads to ideas like representative government, like democracy later, although Hobbes and Locke personally were not fans of democracy. They considered that to be like government of the hordes or the masses on there. But you can kind of see where we got the idea of having a representative government, because it's the people in our country that vote for those leaders that are supposed to represent the interests that we have, or the things that we need. Now, Locke had a tremendously positive influence on the idea of constitutionalism, a direct oppositional philosophy to absolutism, especially in context in 1689 to the end of the Glorious Revolution under the new monarchy in England of William and Mary of Orange from the Netherlands, in which the monarchy for the first time will agree to share power with the Parliament and then sign off on the English Bill of Rights. It's an incredibly massive moment, especially a country as big as England has become now. At this point, we're getting around the time period now of the empire where the sun never sets. Right, this is a massive navy, a massive colonial empire. What England does obviously sets a precedent for other countries, not only in Europe but maybe around the rest of the world, and it's one of the main reasons why we study this. Now, to set it into our last segment, our last section of the main segment of the podcast, let's look at the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and 1689. So let's fast forward into the future, past the English Civil War, past Cromwell, past Charles I, and past Charles II as well. Charles II was a lot more popular than his father, Charles I. And let's go all the way to James II. Now, James II in 1688, he's going to be a controversial king because he is going to be Catholic. And as many of you know from Unit 2, back with Henry VIII, England had been converted over with the Church of England to Anglican in being a Protestant church. So to be a Catholic king in this Protestant country now for over a century is going to be controversial in itself. But just like we saw with Ferdinand attempting to do in the German states with getting rid of the Peace of Augsburg, we now see James II thinks that it is wise to reintroduce Catholicism as the predominant religion in England, which is going to lead to, of course, widespread opposition amongst people in England, because we've seen it now for over a century be predominantly Protestant. So this usually doesn't go over well when you're trying to force this. And eventually, the rebellion that starts against James, that's why this revolution is often called the bloodless revolution. It's one of the few revolutions of the year where there's very little to no killing at all. Eventually, to avoid anything like that, to avoid a civil war or whatnot, King James II actually escapes and flees to France and decides to go there. And now this is what we call abdicating, to abdicate or to leave the throne. And that leaves Parliament in England with a difficult decision to make, but one that they're glad to be able to make at this time, and that is, go after and try to communicate with a family member of James II, like his daughter Mary. So Mary is married at this time to the Dutch Republic, monarch of William of Orange. So the Parliament in England will be asking William of Orange and his wife Mary to come up to England and then rule England, to take over the throne after James II had abdicated it. And this is going to officially oust and remove James II as the king, and this is why we call it the Glorious Revolution. As I said before, it was a relatively bloodless transfer of power, and it's going to establish parliamentary supremacy over the monarch. Now the parliament itself will have even more power over the monarch than what we saw after the end of the English Civil War. And this revolution will solidify and make it to where permanently we see, or at least for a long time, we're going to see constitutionalism to a degree at one point or another. And then we see things like prime ministers ruling today and presidents and things like that. Now, the document, again, the English Bill of Rights in 1689, there are provisions in that document that include things like the rights of the Parliament, restrictions on the monarch, and, of course, we go back to Locke there earlier, guarantees of individual rights, another unprecedented thing to have in a governing document that could set a precedent for other countries later on as we go forward in Europe. Because I call this unit kind of the rise of absolute monarchs, but it's also the beginning of the decline of absolute monarchs too. And we see that all the way through as we go through Unit 5 towards Christmas time. Now, the English Bill of Rights, it lays the foundation for a modern constitutional governments that we know of today, eventually limiting the power of absolutism in favor between a monarchy and representative institutions. But eventually we will see things like this lead to modern day democracies. So one could argue that we would not have democracies today. We would not have what we know of today if it wasn't for ideas like constitutionalism that the Dutch Republic and that England were instituting. And eventually we'll even see massive countries like, of course, France end up like losing theirs as we go from 1789 all the way to the 1830s, is that we see eventually the decline of their monarchy and then them going into a republic and constitutionalism as well. But not going to be without a lot of bloodshed. Very different than a Glorious Revolution. That's going to be an extremely violent and uncertain time period for the French. Now, as always, on these content episodes, I like to finish the episode for you as the listener, whether you're a teacher or a student or a history enthusiast, to leave you some philosophical questions to ruminate on, to ask yourself, to maybe test yourself on how well you know the content now, how well you can connect it to other things in the past or in the future. Now, in light of Hobbes, for question number 1, and Locke, many teachers do a Hobbes and Locke like debate, or they compare sources together. The fact that they have differing views on the government decide which philosophy better reflects modern views of government and society. Is security or individual freedom more important in times of crisis? And within something like this, you can discuss how Hobbes and Locke's ideas have influenced modern political thought, particularly in situations where governments must balance security and freedom, like after the 9/11 policies. We see a lot of nationalist policies after 9/11 with national security. We saw a lot of restrictions of individual freedoms during COVID-19. You can go back into World War II, and we saw Japanese Americans on the West Coast being taken from their homes and businesses and put in internment camps. And those are obviously going against civil rights and going against freedom of American citizens. But that was supposedly done in national defense. So this is a great debate question on, out of those two gentlemen and their philosophies, Hobbes and Locke, which one do we rely on more today for our modern views of government, and what's more justified during times of crisis like a war or something like that? Is it more about safety and security, or is it more about protecting individual freedoms? Because obviously in a situation like that, I understand that there will be freedoms that will be sacrificed, but one could ask, like, to what extent? Like, where does something like that end at? All of that can be an extremely slippery slope, but it is a fun discussion and debate to be able to have. And maybe you can institute that in the area that you actually teach Hobbes and Locke together, or save it till the end of the unit. And it's probably where I'm going to use it at. Now, question 2, the last part of the podcast today. Was the Glorious Revolution truly a revolution, given that it was relatively bloodless? What does this moment in history suggest about the power of ideas versus force in bringing about change? And that's something that can be easily brought up. Lots of events in history. You can even spiral back to Martin Luther and the 95 Theses again, and the Diet of Worms, and his conflict with the church. It doesn't have to be only a political one, but any situation where the power of ideas struggles versus force or authority of one way or another. So again, 2 philosophy questions that I think could go really well in your classroom or your friend group or whatever it is that you're trying to kind of dig into. And who knows, I might throw these up on the Discord later whenever I get that going, and we can have a great discussion with all of us that are interested in history. Now, when you're doing that question, make sure to reflect and explore the notion of what a revolution actually is, whether it requires violence or not, or simply just a change in governing policies. and the long-term impacts of the Glorious Revolution on eventually democratic governments worldwide. So I think that completes us for episode 29 today and the beginning of Unit 3. We covered a lot of major topics today, a little bit of a longer beginning, but I want to try to break up this unit in 3 pieces, just like I did with Unit 1 and 2. And again, if you've already started teaching this unit, I apologize. I'm going at the pace that I go with only teaching 40-minute classes daily, whereas I know some of you are already about to get into Unit 4 soon because you're trying to teach the whole course in a semester, which again, that's got to be extremely difficult to be able to do that. But obviously, you're going to have these audio recordings if you need them for the second semester too, if you want to tie that in there. Now remember, there are many topics that you could go into, many nuanced arguments that you can make and bring up about these. This is just an overall summary. In the future, I will come back and we'll do hyper-focused episodes on these topics to dig as deep as we can. But the purpose of these 3-part series episodes is just a generalized summary of major topics, major people, major events that you should know going into these topics, or whether you're a student or you're a teacher or just a history enthusiast. So again, I look forward to digging deeper, especially maybe even having some guests on from past podcasts or future podcast guests on. So if you're a history enthusiast, if you are a teacher or student, you really want to join me on an episode in the future to spotlight yourself, to discuss a certain topic in history, by all means, email me. At the bottom in the show notes, I have email links for my school email. I have email links for trappedinhistory@gmail. We also have our Substack link. We have the Facebook group link. I'm trying to create a community here little by little over time, and this is all about my own personal journey because doing these podcasts help me to teach the topic better, and it's making me better as an individual as well. So I would love to have any of you on. If you have better ideas, better way of going over the content or sources you would like to share, by all means, reach out. I would love to be able to collaborate with you on that. So as always, I hope that you all have a wonderful Friday, a great weekend, and as always, be contagious.